hopefully they won't.
Yeah,
I'm loving the clock.
I'll wait for that. Welcome to 11 o'clock.
Okay, this is just on, so.
That's it.
Perfect.
We gotta be done by noon.
Oh no, or 11:15 at this rate. Hello.
Hush.
So, Pop, I'm here today because you have an amazing story about being a child at Hickam Field during the raid at Pearl Harbor, and I was wondering if you could share your story with me.
I'll try. I don't know if you want a beginning, how I got there. When I was
All of this would be great.
When I was a little kid, my folks were divorced, and in June of 1941, my dad finally sent for me to go to Hawaii to live with he and my stepmother. And so I arrived this was during the peak of the Depression, and times were really tough. I mean, my sister and I had been in foster homes, et cetera, but...
Why were you in foster homes?
Well, because my mother was working in a necktie factory. She made $4 a week, and she just couldn't take care of us. And so when my dad sent for me, she could take care of my sister, but she couldn't take care of 2 kids. So then I arrived in Hawaii, and my dad worked for the government and civil service, and he worked at Hickam Field, and that's how and we lived in Hickam housing, the same as the military did, but they were nice Hickam housing.
Right on. How old were you?
When I went to Hawaii, I was 9 years old.
9 years old. And tell us about the political climate and the war that you can recall leading up to December 7th.
Well, being only 9 years old, nothing. I mean,
okay.
In Hawaii, the Japanese, they were open 7 days a week. We traded with the Japanese. There was no indication in Hawaii there was going to be a war. I know after I grew up and I started reading about what was going on in the world, Roosevelt wanted to go to war and the Congress wouldn't let him, and they had given the Japanese a deadline to get out of Burma, and that deadline was December 7th, 1941, and they didn't get out.
Yeah.
But that was just the recollections of. I mean, there was really nothing going on in Hawaii unusual at that time. There were no. I mean, as soon as the war started, there was barbed wire on the beach, and it was a totally different atmosphere. But up until then, it was just you lived in Hawaii.
What was an average day like for you hanging out with your dad?
Well, my dad worked, and my mother worked, my stepmother worked, and I couldn't stand my stepmother's cooking. And my dad got after me one day and says, you really ought to congratulate Kim on something that she cooked for you. And every day she would leave food in the refrigerator. I'd come home from school and have my lunch, and it was awful. And anyway, one day she made liverwurst sandwiches, which was terrible. And I told her how good they were. And every day for then till the day I left Hawaii, there were liverwurst sandwiches. But then when the war came, we went to school, and we went 6 days a week because we only went 4 hours a day. And I didn't have any supervision at 9 years old. I mean, my dad worked, and I would spend most of my time alone. I could go to the beach, or if I had a dime, I could go to the movie. But then after the war, I say you couldn't go to the beach because it was all Waikiki was all barbed wire from stem to stern, and we had left Hickam, and we weren't living at Hickam anymore. But so I was close to the beach, but we couldn't go. Anyway,
So, December 7th rolls around, you wake up, and what'd you do?
December 7th, I got up, I was outside, and I was playing in the car, driving the car.
What kind of car?
It was a 1939 Pontiac.
No, I love that you remember that.
Well, it's like vivid in my mind. And all of a sudden, these planes came over, and they were flying at about 50, maybe 100 feet, and they were flying right over Hickam at a very low altitude. And then they would go over and drop their bombs on Pearl, and then come over Pearl City, and so you couldn't shoot at them except when they were directly overhead.
Could you see the pilots from where you
Yes, we could. I went up and got my dad up, and he says, "Oh, that's just military exercises, the Marines or something." He didn't believe it. And then we looked out the window, and it was actually we had a two-story barracks, I guess, and they were that low you could see the pilots flying between the houses, and then he says, "Oh Jesus," and off we went. And you could see at that time black curling smoke coming out of Pearl, and it was obvious it wasn't an exercise.
Right on. So what was your dad's reaction when he realized?
Well, he immediately gathered us up, my mother and I, my stepmother and I, and he took us up into the mountains where he had some friends that had a place up there. So because there was at that time on the radio they were talking about invasions and whatever, and he wanted to take us as far away from the beach and far away from the military facility as possible. And as we were going up into the mountains, the plane, one of the Zeros strafed our car, and I think there were like 9 bullet holes in it.
What side of the car were you on?
I was in the back seat. But the bullet holes were on the roof. And
Wow.
Anyway, he got us to our friend's house, and I remember they had a big old radio, and had a green eye right in the middle of it. And I'd lay on the floor, and you'd be listening to the news, and it was as it developed. But I was so little, I don't remember vividly all the details. But my dad had to go back to Hickam and reported to work to do whatever needed to be done, whatever they were doing there. And so he left us, and he was gone about 4 or 5 days, and we didn't know if he was dead or alive, or whether the Japanese had invaded, or what was going on. We were just kind of and then finally he came back up, and then we moved to Kaimaki, which is out of Hickam housing.
Who did you stay with during those times?
It was friends of my dad. I don't know. I don't know that I ever seen him before or since. It was just a couple, and we stayed at their house. That's all I really remember. And of course, my stepmother, she was a nurse, and so she worked at Tripler Army Hospital, and so she was going to work every day. So just the couple and us were up there, but that was it. I don't know.
How does a 9-year-old process sitting in the back seat of a car being strafed by a Zero?
It doesn't bother you.
No?
I mean, you're not aware of. I mean, I never was frightened ever. I mean, you can't conceive of what's going on around you. You're just part of it, and you know something's wrong, but it's not even surreal. You just, what can you do? Here you are.
You're in the back seat.
Back seat.
So, is there anything else that you remember from the days following, and your father's behavior and the behavior of the base?
Yeah, the most suspicious thing is the Japanese stores were open 7 days a week. December 7th, they were all closed. Even though the bombing didn't start till 7 o'clock in the morning, they were all closed. And we found that very suspicious, although being 9 years old, I didn't, other than hearing people talk about it, this was really odd. That
Say that again.
that was and then, of course, the change in the life at the beach, because Waikiki Beach was no longer Waikiki Beach. It was fortified, and then on one occasion, I think I had mentioned once before to you about there was a hangar. It was called at Hickam. It was called the instrument hangar, where all the instruments for the P-40s and the other planes were stored. And the night before Pearl Harbor, my dad worked. That's why he was sleeping in on Sunday morning. And they moved everything out of that hangar. And that hangar was destroyed the next day, and the one they moved to was not touched, which tells you a certain amount of sabotage went on. And then before we actually moved from Hickam, I was taking my dad his lunch one afternoon. Well, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He worked nights, and there was a 1934 Ford with, I believe, 4 Japanese guys approached the gate, and the guard held halt, halt, halt. They didn't halt, and in those days they had Thompson submachine guns, and they just obliterated that car. But and again, you're 9 years old. I said, "Wow, you're not frightened. You remember it." And then after the maybe I'm going beyond what you want to do, but after that, my dad made an application for me to come back to the States because there was the fear of invasion, and up until I came back on the Mariposa, which was the Matson line, sister ship to the Lurline, and we were the first ship that came back without an escort, and that was kind of different because they weren't letting anybody come back. Well, it took 6 months. I came back in June of '42, and my dad hired somebody to take care of me. Well, from the minute we stepped on the ship, I never saw that woman again, ever. And we were about halfway across the Pacific, and all of a sudden the alarm goes off, and you don your life jackets. This is not a drill. This is real. And so we all did. You go up this sub surfaces. I don't know, I'm getting teary-eyed, but some Americans. That was a relief. And then we get to San Francisco, and there's pea soup fog, and San Francisco Harbor was heavily mined. So we laid outside of San Francisco for almost 3 days before the ship got into a dock. And in those days, your mail was censored. My mother knew I was coming, but she had no idea when or on what ship I was coming. And this woman was supposed to deliver me. Well, she didn't. So I wound up in a big concrete building with cots in it. I don't know why it bothers me.
We can take a moment if you'd like.
No, it's all right. Anyway, I was a refugee. And I couldn't remember my mother's married name. So it's the Red Cross was taking care of us. So finally remember they live in Modesto and their name is Shimon. And they just put me on a bus. And all the way from San Francisco, every town we stopped at, I said, "Is this Modesto? Is this Modesto?"
Modesto, yeah.
And I get there, and I call one person, and all the Shimons were related. And it wasn't my mother, but it was, I forget the name. Joe Shimon. And he says, "Your mother's on the way." So that was it.
How long from the time that you were put on the boat from Hawaii, how long was that until you met up with your parents?
Okay, well, going over on the Lurline, it was a luxury trip, and it was 7 days. Coming back, they were really steaming. We got back in 5. But I know we laid outside San Francisco for a couple of days. I don't know everybody seemed to be having a good time, really. I mean, it wasn't, and in those days, when you went on a ship, they had first class, second class, and cabin class. And of course, I came back in cabin class where you shared a room with 3 other guys, and you didn't even know them. You just shared a room with them. But it was, even though it wasn't a luxury cruise, and you couldn't leave your deck. I mean, if you were in cabin class, you stayed in cabin class. First class could go anywhere they wanted. Second class could go down, but they couldn't go up. But it was an experience.
I mean, in 2015 today, it would be an outrage for a 9-year-old to be left alone on a boat for a week.
He paid her, and she disappeared.
So what did you do for those days with your bunkmates and on that level?
I had a good time. Yeah, I mean, the food was good, and I was telling Whitney, there were 3 adult males in my room, and they had games for the kids to play, and I won a potato race and a potato sack, and I won something else, and I had these little prizes. And I went back to my room one evening, and I have the upper bunk, and there's somebody in my bunk, and I said, oh my God, I'm so scared, I'm all by myself. These guys had blown up balloons and had my bed full of balloons.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I don't even remember any of these guys. I mean, they were all adult males. But I remember being really frightened. And to this day, if I get lost, I panic. Because nobody's ever going to find me.
That's genetic. I have that same thing.
Now we know where that comes from, I can't imagine. I remember when I was 5 and I was putzing around, not getting ready for school, and mom told me, she said, if you don't get on that bus, I'm going to kill you. She's joking around, but I'm 5. I am terrified. So I'm out the door with one shoe on. I'm running across the street. I see the bus just go. I am not going back home. I know what's going to happen if I go back home. So I'm walking around downtown Bakersfield, going around the roundabout downtown, walking up Chester Lane, following buses. I'm seeing buses everywhere, so I'm just following buses. I'm like, when I find a bus, I'm going to get to school, right? I end up tired. I'm at a Del Taco on Truxton and Chester when there was a Del Taco there. And I walk in and I'm crying. And the person behind the counter's like, are you okay? And I'm like, I'm lost. I know mom's phone number, so I give them mom's phone number. She's leaving for work when the phone rings. They're giving me ice cream, trying to calm me down. My mom thinks I'm on the bus. She comes rushing in. She said, what happened? I said, I missed the bus and I didn't want you to kill me.
I bet she has a whole different take on this
But
story.
being lost, I definitely was afraid.
Oh yeah, and I think particularly by being on the ship and being a refugee, and when I go to the store with my mother, if I couldn't see her, I just would panic if she wasn't there. But, and if I'm somewhere, thank God for GPS, because if I'm somewhere now and I get lost, I panic. But I'm never going to get out of here. That's anyway. This is off the subject.
No, this is really good. I think we've covered the event that we wanted to cover, but you've lived a pretty awesome life.
Let me start and stop.